This mud may look lifeless, a forgotten patch of earth baked by the Mesopotamian sun. But beneath it lies a silence that once roared with invention, language, and ritual. Here, nearly 7,000 years ago, a civilization emerged, not over centuries, of slow trial and error, but seemingly overnight. They charted the stars. They built great temples of layered brick without cranes or blueprints. They etched the first writing into clay already systematized, already complex. As if remembering something rather than inventing it, science tells us that civilizations grow slowly, layer by layer, generation by generation, but the Sumerians defy this narrative. There is no long prelude, no series of stepping stones. One moment, scattered tribes. The next, city-states governed by priest-kings and code-makers. And then, just as quickly, they vanish absorbed, forgotten, buried under their own brilliance. Who are they? Where did their knowledge come from? And why does so much of what they left behind echo through later cultures and faiths? This is not just a history of the first civilization. It is a riddle etched in stone, whispered by ruins, and still unsolved by modern science. If we can't explain how the world's first civilization came to be, then what else don't we know about our past? The Sumerians didn't just build cities, they built the very idea of civilization. Writing, law, taxation, astronomy, irrigation, trade. They invented the systems we still rely on today. Strip Sumer from the timeline, and there is no Babylon. Number Egypt, no Greece or Rome. The modern world rests on foundations we barely understand, and yet, for all their influence, the origins of the Sumerians remain a blank slate. We have their tablets, their temples, their myths, but not their beginnings. Science can document the bricks they laid and the tools they used, but not the leap that turned farmers into architects or oral tales into epic literature. We study their legacy, but not their mind. This matters. Because if the blueprint for civilization itself is missing its first page, then our entire story is less certain than we think. We are inheritors of knowledge whose source we cannot trace. We live in cities shaped by people we do not know, speaking ideas they first imagined. And until we understand how it all began, we cannot fully understand who we are. For thousands of years, humanity wandered. Clans of hunter-gatherers followed the rhythms of wild rivers and shifting herds, leaving behind only traces flint tools, fire pits, bones, and scattered campsites. Then, without warning, something changed. On the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, amid the windswept marshes where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, a city rose. Not a village, not a camp, an organized, sacred place called Eridu, the first true city. And no one knows why it happened there, or why it happened then. There was no slow climb. No centuries-long transition from scattered hamlets to urban planning. The evidence is abrupt. In the archaeological record, Eridu appears with a temple. Not a crude hut, but a sophisticated structure raised on a platform aligned to celestial cycles, suggesting cosmology, priesthood, planning. People built canals to direct water. They formed terraces to elevate sacred spaces. They gathered in numbers too great for chance alone to explain. It's as if someone lit a torch in the dark, and civilization answered the flame. Why here? Why this patch of mud and silt at the edge of the Persian Gulf? The land wasn't forgiving. The soil was saline. Rainfall was sparse. Nomads passed through, but few stayed until Eridu, and then suddenly permanence. Agriculture intensified, but not just through trial and error. The early inhabitants deployed irrigation systems requiring knowledge of hydraulics, land elevation, and seasonal flooding. Where did that knowledge come from? It doesn't appear in surrounding regions. It doesn't evolve gradually. It simply exists. And why then? Around 5500 BC, Long before Egypt's pyramids or the wheel's invention, Eridu was already defining sacred space, storing surplus grain, and building tiered temples from sun-dried brick. There is no obvious external pressure, no military threat, no resource crisis to push humans to this level of organization. The conventional story of necessity birthing invention doesn't hold. It feels instead like a spark, as though a blueprint was suddenly put into motion. This is the mystery of Eridu, the cradle of a civilization that should not have existed yet. It's not that they build a city, it's that they build a city at the beginning without precedent, as if guided by knowledge no one else possessed. How did they know what no one else did? How did they master irrigation without predecessors? That question cuts to the core of the mystery. Southern Mesopotamia's unforgiving terrain. Rainfall is rare, the rivers flood unpredictably and without control. The land alternates between drought and deluge. Yet the people of Eridu didn't just survive there, they thrived. And they did it through sophisticated irrigation, centuries ahead of what science would expect from any so-called stone. Each society. The question is not whether they irrigated. It's how they learned to do it so early and so well dug by 5000 BC. The residents of Eridu had already developed basin irrigation systems. These weren't shallow ditches scratched in mud. They were coordinated networks of canals, levees, sluices, and reservoirs that required a grasp of water dynamics, elevation gradients, and seasonal hydrology. They designed channels that funneled river water across fields during flood months and diverted excess to avoid salinization. In effect, they turned desert marshes into arable farmland. But this wasn't an invention born of trial and error over millennia. The record shows the technology appears complete, mature, and strategically deployed. There is no evidence of clumsy, failed versions of irrigation systems that eventually evolved into better ones. No intermediary designs. What we see instead is a full-fledged hydraulic system operating in tandem with organized labor and central planning. Someone had to measure distances, coordinate digging schedules, and allocate water rights. This implies leadership, consensus, mathematics, and timekeeping. Yet at this point, writing doesn't exist. There's no documented bureaucracy. It's as though knowledge was passed through memory, ritual, or some forgotten system of communication that modern archaeology has yet to decipher. The anomaly deepens when you realize that surrounding regions offer no precedent. No parallel experimentation in Turkey, Iran, or the Levant leads to Mesopotamia's hydraulic breakthroughs. In fact, the surrounding uplands had more rainfall and needed no such systems. So where, then, did the expertise emerge from? How did they solve problems no one had yet encountered? It's not just about canals, it's about organization. It's about foresight, even today. Rebuilding some of the ancient irrigation lines using Bronze Age tools would be a monumental engineering task. Yet these early Sumerians achieved it with nothing more than mud, wood, and communal knowledge. This wasn't a fluke. It was systematized, sustained, and scaled. And that fact sits awkwardly against everything we're told about how civilizations developed. What if irrigation in Mesopotamia wasn't an invention, but a reapplication, something remembered rather than discovered? Scholars have debated whether older, now lost cultures passed knowledge down into the Fertile Crescent. Oral traditions, myths, and later religious texts often speak of knowledge descending to humans from gods, from sky beings, from sages. Who came before? Is this myth or memory? That's the tension. Because either we're missing huge chapters of human history, or the first civilization came equipped with knowledge that, by all accounts, it should not have had. No slow buildup, just ... Emergence, the birth of civilization, is supposed to be gradual. That's the model. First small camps, then villages, slowly scaling into towns, eventually cities. It should take millennia, each innovation layered upon countless generations of effort. But in the case of Sumer, specifically at Eridu, that timeline collapses. One moment, we have scattered Neolithic settlements. The next, a planned city, with temples, granaries, social classes, and trade networks. There's no slow ramp up. Civilization doesn't crawl into view. It leaps. When archaeologists excavated Eridu, they expected to find layers of messy, incremental progress, failed city, plans, rudimentary dwellings, interrupted growth. Instead, what they uncovered was shockingly consistent. As early as 5400 BC, Eridu had structures aligned with cosmic order, a ziggurat platform rising layer by layer with ceremonial intent, and evidence of centralized control over labor and resources. It was already a symbolic center, a religious capital for people who supposedly hadn't yet developed writing or metallurgy. This is not how civilizations are supposed to behave in their infancy. Where are the mistakes? Where is the confusion that marks most first attempts at social complexity? Instead, the Sumerians begin with purpose. Their cities are built to a plan, their religious centers are embedded in social governance, and their iconography shows a mature symbolic language long before cuneiform. What's more startling is that this pattern repeats across multiple sites. Uruk, your Nippur-al seem to appear not as evolutionary endpoints, but as sudden expressions of a system already understood. It's as though city planning, religious hierarchy, and economic specialization weren't learned, they were remembered. From where? No one knows. Even the earliest material culture of Ooredoo suggests familiarity with long-distance trade, with polished ceramics and exotic stones sourced hundreds of miles away. These are not the traits of a society discovering itself. These are the markers of a system that arrived ready, fully formed. Some scholars argue that what we're seeing is simply the archaeological record being incomplete, that the earlier messiances was washed away by time. But the consistency, the scale, the synchronicity of emergence across the region, it suggests otherwise. We aren't missing the past. The past itself may have skipped steps. This is the uncomfortable implication that civilization didn't rise slowly, but burst forth. That Eridu wasn't the first experiment, it was the first recollection. And that forces we don't yet understand accelerated the Sumerian rise in ways that continue to defy academic explanation. Something was different here. Something changed. By 4000 BC, something unprecedented began to unfold on the plains of southern Mesopotamia. Cities didn't just grow, they erupted. And the most famous of them all, Uruk, emerged with such scale and complexity that modern scholars are still unsure how it was even possible. It wasn't just the first true city, it was a blueprint for civilization. But what's most mysterious isn't the scale, it's the synchronization. Across Mesopotamia, urban centers started developing simultaneously, with standardized measurements, temple systems, religious rituals, and economic practices, all before a single wheel had turned on a cart or a single empire had drawn borders. To enforce conformity, the first anomaly appears in their writing. Cuneiform doesn't evolve slowly from scratches to signs. It arrives functional, already a complete writing system. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dated to around 3300 BC, are administrative, yes, but they show a staggering level of sophistication. Number systems, commodity tracking, bureaucratic formatting, hieroglyphs for barley, livestock, oil, temples, land plots, as if this was not the invention of writing, but its inheritance. There's no learning curve visible. It's as though someone already knew how to encode language into symbol and simply pressed it into clay. Who taught them to write? This question still divides scholars. Theories abound. economic necessity, religious record keeping, elite administration, but none explain the full picture. Writing emerges in temple precincts, not royal courts. It's sacred before it's secular. That's the pattern. Which brings us to another puzzle. Why were religious centers preeminent before armies, before kings? Every Sumerian city-state was built around a temple complex, a ziggurat rising like a mountain from the plains, symbolizing divine authority. Priests administered trade, land, irrigation, and justice long before generals did. Governance was spiritual first, political later. This isn't typical. In most civilizations, power begins with warfare. Here, it began with ritual. Even more strange is how the cities operated in coordination, despite being politically fragmented. There was no empire, no unifying monarch. And yet, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, Nippur all adopted the same systems. Weight standards, calendrical cycles, scribal scripts, architectural patterns. This wasn't random, it was unified. But by what mechanism? Decentralized societies don't usually produce uniformity. If anything, they tend toward chaos and divergence. But Sumer seems to have avoided this. Somehow, temple elites across vast distances agreed on economic standards, iconography, and legal frameworks. No armies enforced these standards. No central authority mandated them. The convergence was cultural, or perhaps ideological. Some speculate a shared priestly class traveled between cities, coordinating theology and practice. Others point to trade, that the economic interdependence between cities forced standardization. But the synchronization is too early, too consistent. It suggests deliberate design. And again, we must remember, this was all happening before the wheel, before carts, roads, chariots, and yet long-distance trade was booming. We find lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, obsidian from Anatolia, and shell from the Persian Gulf. These weren't incidental exchanges. They were sustained commercial routes operating through temple complexes that acted as both storehouses and customs houses. The logistics alone are mind-boggling. Who managed this? How were resources tracked, moved, stored, and redistributed without centralized oversight or written law codes that we've yet discovered? Then there's the issue of time. This entire transformation occurs within a few centuries, a blink. In civilizational terms, Uruk alone may have reached a population of over 50,000 by 3100 BC, making it the largest city in the world. Yet there are no clear signs of gradual population growth from nearby villages. The city seems to form, not grow. Where did the people come from? How did they organize so quickly? One theory suggests that climate change may have pushed nomadic peoples into settled life. But even that doesn't explain the precision. Building a city requires more than people. It requires planning, water control, division of labor, leadership, and knowledge of metallurgy, measurement, and administration. These don't arise simultaneously by accident. Someone or some system was coordinating it. The architecture reinforces this. Uruk's sacred precinct of Aina featured monumental temples decorated with cone mosaics, limestone foundations, columned halls, not the work of amateurs, nor are they copies of earlier designs. These structures appear at their first iteration with aesthetic and functional mastery. There are no crude proto-ziggurats. They start at scale. The social structure mirrors the built environment. Class stratification is visible early: administrators, workers, priests, artisans. Economic systems revolve around temple-controlled storage and redistribution. And yet, no centralized state enforced this. It's as though ideology, not politics, created cohesion. A spiritual blueprint, not a political one. So we're left with a paradox. This wasn't chaos. It was coordinated. But by who? There's no written record explaining who set these standards. No surviving manifesto or unifying doctrine. Just the outcome: synchronized urbanism, widespread literacy, centralized religion, advanced trade in a world that had only recently emerged from scattered Neolithic farms. It's not that the Sumerians were ahead of their time. It's that they seem to have skipped the time required to get there. Before kings ruled with swords or scribes ruled with styluses, Sumer was ruled by gods. Not abstract deities, not distant creators, but embodied beings who walked among men, or so the records say. In Sumerian belief, the divine was not something far away to be worshipped in concept. It was local, tangible, present in temple and storm and ruler. Their gods had names, addresses, rituals, and duties. And the cities of Sumer weren't just urban centers. They were the domains of gods themselves, each with a temple that served as a cosmic embassy between the heavens and the earth. At the center of this divine order stood the ziggurat, not a temple in the modern sense, but a technological and symbolic axis between the material and the divine. Towering platforms layered skyward, these stepped structures weren't built to accommodate worshippers. Their summit was a restricted zone reserved for the god alone. Priests would ascend, offerings in hand, while the rest of the city looked up, quite literally, to the source of divine power. These were sacred machines, operating on both spiritual and astronomical levels. That's where the mystery deepens. Many of these ziggurats were astronomically aligned, following solstice and equinox paths with startling accuracy. Ina, the sacred precinct of Inanna in Uruk, is theorized to have tracked Venus, the goddess's celestial avatar. In Nippur, the temple of Enlil mirrored stellar positions, allowing priests to calculate omens based on planetary movement. This wasn't superstition, it was system. What we call astrology, they called divine correspondence. But how did a culture with no telescopes, no compasses, and no modern mathematics chart the sky with such precision? Why was this level of cosmic accuracy embedded into the very foundations of their cities? It becomes more curious when we examine their pantheon. Sumerian gods are not merely proto-pagan spirits. They are personalities with interlocking mythologies, jurisdictions, and narrative arcs. And Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Utu, these weren't just spirits. They were rulers, engineers, seducers, judges, lawgivers. And their stories ... sound familiar. In Enki, the god of wisdom and water, we see echoes of Prometheus and Noah. In Inanna's descent into the underworld, we hear Persephone's footsteps. In the Great Flood, we hear not metaphor, but warning. Consider this. The Sumerian flood myth predates the book of Genesis by over 1,000 years. Ziusudra, the chosen man warned by a god to build a boat and save life from a world-ending flood, is the direct precursor to Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh and to Noah in the Hebrew Bible. The structure is nearly identical. The divine warning, the vessel, the survival, the mountain landing, the covenant. Is this convergent storytelling or inherited memory? And then there's Inanna, the goddess of war, love, and chaos. Her myths are not gentle. They are raw with power, seduction, deception, and death. In one tale, she steals the sacred Nijivine decrees of civilization from Enki. In another, she descends into the underworld, stripped layer by layer of her identity. These aren't parables. They read more like coded lessons, perhaps allegories for seasonal cycles, for state control, for psychological transformation, or maybe more. The Sumerians didn't separate myth from science. To them, one was the language of the other. And then there's Enki, whose domain was freshwater, magic, and knowledge. He creates humans from clay, He sets the laws of rivers and temples. He even manipulates in a list of destinies called the Me. Enki doesn't behave like a god of thunder or vengeance. He behaves like a designer, methodical, measured, technical. His temples weren't just places of worship, they were centers of learning, healing, and coordination. Could this be symbolic? Of course. But the structure of the myths suggests something more functional, almost archival in nature. So what if their gods were not metaphors? What if the Sumerians were preserving knowledge advanced for their time, encoded in story because story endures? The ziggurat wasn't just a shrine. It was a calendar, a weather station, a symbol of tiered reality. The myths weren't fantasies. They were technologies of memory, and the gods weren't hallucinations, they were models, archetypes, possibly even echoes of forgotten ancestors or lost teachers, whose knowledge survived not in instruction manuals but in mythic code. This is where the Sumerian enigma reaches its most unsettling edge. We assume ancient people invented gods to explain the unknown, but in Sumer, the gods seem to precede the complexity, not follow it. Writing was invented in temples. Architecture centered on divine coordinates. Civic planning followed religious logic. It's almost as if the civilization was given its structure and the gods were the reason why. Were they symbols? Maybe, but symbols of what? This wasn't chaos. It was coordinated, but not by kings or armies, by something older. Something that claimed to walk beside them, guide them, demand temples in their name. Perhaps the most astonishing part of the Sumerian story is that they believed utterly that their gods weren't watching from above. They were already here. The stars told time before the calendar. Long before astronomy became a science, the Sumerians were tracking celestial movements with astonishing accuracy. Their temples, particularly the towering ziggurats, weren't simply shrines, they were aligned to the heavens with a precision that challenges expectations. Without sextants, compasses, or telescopes, these early people marked solstices, equinoxes, and planetary paths, embedding the structure of the cosmos into the architecture of their cities. Take the sacred city of Uruk, the Ina temple complex, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, has been linked to the orbital cycle of Venus. Inanna, known as the morning and evening star, corresponds with Venus in both myth and movement. Venus has an unusual cycle of visibility, 5 appearances across 8 years. The Sumerians knew this. They tracked it. And they wove it into their mythology with such accuracy that later Babylonian astronomers built their entire planetary system atop these observations. Were the priests of Uruk merely guessing? The architectural alignments suggest otherwise. Ziggurats were oriented to specific points on the horizon where key stars and planets would rise or set, effectively turning these temples into sky clocks. What's more puzzling is that this astronomical knowledge was not isolated. Across the Sumerian landscape, from Nippur to Eridu, alignments to cardinal directions and stellar events recur. Nippur, considered the spiritual capital of Sumer, was laid out with reference to true north. It's here that priests tracked celestial phenomena to create the first known lunisolar calendar, the ancestor of our own reckoning of time. But how? How did a people without lenses map the skies with such fidelity? Some scholars suggest they relied on simple tools, plumb lines, horizon markers, water clocks. But this doesn't fully explain the breadth and synchronicity of astronomical accuracy across cities. The mystery is not just in how they observed the heavens, but why they centered their civilization on that knowledge. For the Sumerians, the sky wasn't abstract, it was law. To violate celestial order was to risk divine chaos. In aligning their cities to the stars, they weren't simply making observations. They were anchoring society to the very rhythms of the cosmos. If Sumer was the first civilization, then its gods were the prototypes. And yet, reading Sumerian myths today feels strangely familiar. Their divine characters, full of rivalry, seduction, wrath, and mercy, would not be out of place in later Greek, Roman, or Abrahamic traditions. It's not just thematic resemblance. It's structural inheritance. Consider Anu, the sky god. Distant, sovereign, rarely involved in mortal affairs. He precedes and grants power to other gods, much like the concept of a high god or prime mover in later systems. Or Enlil, his son, god of air, storms, and command. Enlil creates order through force, punishes humans for noise and disobedience, and floods the world when they displease him. His role echoes Zeus, Yahweh, and Odin all at once. Then there's Enki, the water god, cunning, wise, a protector of humanity. He intervenes to stop endless flood, warning a chosen man in secret. The parallels to Prometheus, Hermes, and even the Gnostic demiurge are difficult to ignore. His gifts to mankind include agriculture, writing, law, and music, not unlike the divine grants of Thoth in Egypt or the Logos in later Hellenistic philosophy. Sumerian myths weren't preserved in isolation. Through Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and later Persian traditions, their divine archetypes filtered into the mythic bloodstream of the ancient world. Even the structure of the Sumerian pantheon, with gods ruling elements, cities, and cosmic forces, formed a model mirrored in Mount Olympus, Asgard, and the angelic hierarchies of medieval theology. In short, the Sumerian gods didn't vanish. They evolved. Their stories were rewritten, renamed, reshaped. But the DNA remains. Ziggurats are some of the most iconic structures in human history. But their purpose remains only partially understood. They weren't tombs. They weren't inhabited. Unlike Egyptian pyramids, ziggurats weren't sealed. They were ascended, layered like steps toward the heavens. These artificial mountains symbolize the axis mundi, the world's central pillar, where heaven met earth. Functionally, they served as religious beacons, visible for miles, anchoring both spiritual and urban life. But some researchers propose additional roles. They were calendars, observatories, even early attempts at climatological engineering. Their placement near rivers, elevation above flood zones, and use in ritual processions hint at environmental as well as theological planning. The movement up the ziggurat was symbolic, ascending from the human realm through the sacred tiers of existence, earth, sky, stars, and beyond. Some Sumerian texts suggest the ziggurat's peak was the dwelling place of the god when he or she visited the earth. Offerings were placed there, music played, incense burned. The structure became a receiver, a communication portal between the human and divine. This wasn't metaphor in Sumerian thinking. It was logistics. The ziggurat wasn't built to impress. It was built to work. Even the materials, mud brick, fired brick, bitumen, show layered technological awareness. Bitumen, a natural asphalt, was used to waterproof foundations and line canals, yet also appeared in temple construction. The blend of sacred and practical suggests a worldview where utility and holiness were not separate. The ziggurat was both a religious altar and an engineering feat, a statement that their gods demanded excellence in both form and function. Sumerian myths are often interpreted as stories. But what if they are more than allegories? What if they encode memories or even misunderstood technology? Take Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and transformation. Her most famous myth describes her descent into the underworld, passing through 7 gates, removing an item of clothing or jewelry at each, dying, and then resurrecting. Symbolists interpret this as a fertility cycle, but others suggest it reflects a ritualized description of ego death, altered consciousness, or even near-death experience. The underworld isn't merely a place, it's a process. A transformation. Then, there's Enki and the Mei, a myth in which Enki sends the sacred Mi, or decrees of civilization, to humanity via Inanna. These Mi govern everything from truth and law to woodworking, prostitution, and scribal arts. It's as if knowledge is being downloaded item by item from a cosmic archive. The list isn't random, it's exhaustive and eerily specific. Is this a metaphor for cultural development? Or a fragmented memory of technology transfer? Most striking is the Sumerian flood myth, embedded in the Eridu Genesis and later adapted in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The god Enlil, angry at human clamor, plans to flood the world, but Enki warns Susura, telling him to build a massive boat to preserve life. The story is detailed, with boat dimensions, cargo, days of storm. Far older than the biblical flood, it is specific in a way myths typically aren't. Scholars see in it memory of an ancient Mesopotamian deluge, perhaps triggered by a sudden rise in the Persian Gulf or a climatic collapse. But again, the line between memory and metaphor is thin. What unites all these myths is the precision. They don't feel like fairy tales. They feel like encoded history, told in symbols because language hadn't yet caught up to concept. They are fragments of something deeper, spoken aloud for generations until finally etched into clay dot by the dawn of the 3rd millennium BC, Sumer had transformed. The sacred cities that once existed as ritual hubs, ruled by priesthoods and guided by divine calendars, now bristled with a new kind of authority, kingship. But this wasn't the democratic rise of civic leadership. This was monarchy declared by gods, born not from consensus, but from myth. And yet, even in this early age, these kings didn't merely govern. They waged war, organized, strategic, and total. Before empires existed, warfare had already become professional. This period, known as the Early Dynastic, saw the rise of independent city-states like Lagash, Amma, Ur, and Kish. Each city was both a political entity and a religious realm. Its patron deity was the true ruler. The king was only a steward, appointed and legitimized through divine will. Titles like Ensi, governor, or Lugal, great man, or king weren't inherited lightly. They were bestowed ceremonially in temples, written into stone, and performed in rituals that mirrored cosmic order. Authority wasn't taken. It was received. But the question remains, why did warfare erupt so early, before there were empires to defend or borders to draw? Cities like Amma and Lagash clashed over canals, field boundaries, grain storage, and religious supremacy. The stele of the vultures, erected by Inadim of Lagash, is among the oldest surviving war monuments. It depicts organized infantry in tight formation, armed with bronze-tipped spears, marching under banners, not as raiders, but as a trained army. Soldiers wear helmets, carry shields, and move as one. This isn't tribal skirmishing. It's state-sanctioned violence, but what's strange is the religious framing. The reverse side of the stele doesn't depict politics or conquest. It shows the god Ninjutsu holding a net filled with the bodies of enemy soldiers, crushing them. Under divine authority, victory isn't credited to the king's brilliance, it's credited to divine intervention. This isn't just propaganda, it's worldview. Kings ruled only as long as the gods favored them. Battles weren't territorial. They were sacred judgments. Still, this doesn't explain the technology leap. Around this time, bronze weaponry appears in mass quantities. Bronze isn't natural. It's an alloy, copper and tin, and requires knowledge of smelting, alloy ratios, and controlled heat. But there's a puzzle. Mesopotamia had copper, but no local tin. Yet the tools of war, helmets, spear tips, axes, daggers, were standardized in form and replicated across cities. Where did this tin come from? How was it transported? How did such a specialized material become so ubiquitous? No earlier source region has yet been definitively identified. Some suggest long-range trade with Afghanistan or Anatolia, but the logistics of moving bulk tin across hundreds of miles through hostile terrain, before roads, before pack animals were fully utilized, is staggering. Yet by 2600 BC, the bronze economy was fully operational. More than a breakthrough, it feels like an insertion, as if a complete technological package simply appears. And with bronze came a new kind of power. Kings began carving their names in stone. The first historical king lists emerge, not myths, but attempts to record dynasties, reigns, and legitimacy. Cities erected monuments, boundary stones, and foundation tablets bearing the mark of individual rulers. But again, these weren't secular leaders. Their power was framed by myth, divine dreams, celestial omens, priestly approval. Every king claimed authority through something older than himself. Kingship wasn't just political. It was cosmic. This is where the story of Lagash and Amma becomes more than just a territorial dispute. These cities weren't just fighting over canals. They were fighting over cosmic inheritance. The god of Lagash had decreed a field sacred. Amma's god disagreed. Their conflict wasn't just between men. It was played out through divine proxy, and the blood spilled was holy. The stele of the vultures, then, is more than just a monument to victory. It is a relic of the moment when sacred warfare first took written, visual form, a declaration that violence could be justified by myth, that state building could wear a halo. It introduces a pattern we would see echoed again and again across history: kings claiming godhood, temples becoming armories, and conquest described not as greed, but as divine duty, and the speed of it all is unnerving. Between 2900 and 2350 BC, city-states that once revolved around humble shrines evolved into fortified, stratified, and militarized theocracies. Each had its own administration, military, economy, and theology, yet each spoke the same language of divine right. The king was no longer a servant of the gods. He became the arm of the gods, a sword in human form. This shift would pave the way for something even greater, the First Empire. But it also raises uncomfortable questions. How did war precede empire? How did bronze metallurgy precede tin infrastructure? How did kings learn to speak in divine terms before the invention of statecraft? It's as if civilization was being led somewhere, guided not just by human ambition, but by an older blueprint, because power doesn't emerge naturally. It has to be justified. And in Sumer, that justification was always divine. Whether through dreams, omens, or the silent weight of stone monuments, kings ruled with the approval of something older and more enduring than the crown. ChatGPT said they called him Sargon, but he wasn't Sumerian. He had no ancient bloodline, no city-state behind him, no ancestral temple to anchor divine legitimacy. He was, by every account, an outsider. A Semitic cupbearer, a servant, someone who in the rigid world of Sumer should have remained invisible. And yet, in one of history's most baffling pivots, he didn't just rise, he conquered. Around 2334 BC, Sargon of Akkad forged the world's first empire, not a loose confederation, not a temporary alliance, but a fully centralized multinational machine of administration, language, law, and logistics. How? There are no clear records of a slow build-up to empire. One decade, the Sumerian. City-states are bickering over irrigation canals. The next, they're all under a single ruler, and not even one of their own. This wasn't just improbable. It was almost impossible for a man of no noble lineage to not only seize power but institutionalize it across hundreds of miles, diverse ethnic groups, and complex religious systems. It defies what we understand about ancient power. Sargon established Akkad, a city no archaeologist has yet definitively located. He introduced a new language, Akkadian, and forced scribes across Sumer to learn it. He invented empire from the edges of civilization and somehow made it last. Even more strangely, Sargon didn't obliterate the gods of the Sumerians. He honored them. He respected their priesthoods. His daughter, Enheduanna, became the high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur and the world's first named author. Under Sargon, religion didn't fracture, it expanded. He offered something rare in ancient power, ideological inclusion, multiple languages, multiple deities, yet a single authority. No ancient kingdom had done that before. The assumption was that you either imposed your god or were destroyed by someone else's, and yet, while building the largest empire the world had ever seen, Sargon remained a man without origin. His legends say he was placed in a basket and floated down a river, an echo that will resurface centuries later in the Moses myth. Who wrote that story first? And why does it align so closely with motifs found later across the ancient world? Was it just cultural resonance, or was Sargon's life so disruptive it demanded myth to make sense? Technocratically, Sargon's empire was decades, perhaps centuries, ahead of its time. Royal messengers on rotating duty stations. Standardized weights and measures. Military logistics on a scale previously thought impossible. Clay tablets show bureaucrats managing taxes, storage, and personnel across regions that had never before coordinated at this level. This wasn't conquest for loot. It was conquest for infrastructure. And yet, it didn't last forever. After about 150 years, the Akkadian Empire crumbled under pressure, internal revolt, environmental catastrophe, and new invasions. But the idea Sargon created, that a ruler could come from nowhere and unite disparate peoples under a single banner of administration and belief, never died. It became a blueprint for Assyria, for Persia, for Alexander, even for modern nation-states. Every centralized regime owes something to this original experiment. Sargon's rise is not just an historical oddity, it's a rupture in the fabric of what we think civilization naturally allows. A moment when someone not just unexpected but impossible redefines what's possible. And it happened over 4,000 years ago in a world we still don't fully understand. After the fall of the Akkadian Empire, Sumer descended into what the texts call a dark age. The Kushans, tribal highlanders with no written language, no cities, and no known religious system, swept down and shattered what Sargon had built. Temples were abandoned, canals silted over, trade collapsed. The silence that followed was so complete that later scribes blamed the Kushans not just for conquest, but for breaking the cosmic order. And yet, out of this chaos, the Sumerians did something no other ancient civilization had done before. They came back. This wasn't mere recovery. It was resurrection. Around 2100 BC, a new dynasty emerged from the city of Ar, led by Ur-Nemmu, a ruler who didn't just restore what had been lost. He rebuilt it bigger, stronger, more ideologically coherent. Historians call this the Year 3 period, but it was more than a political phase. It was a renaissance, a deliberate attempt to remember everything, as if the gods had gone silent, but the people had not forgotten. The temples were restored. The ziggurats, including the great ziggurat of Ur, were reconstructed on a scale that rivaled and exceeded those of earlier times. But this time, they were inscribed with vision. Ur-Nammu and his successors didn't simply invoke the gods, they codified their will. For the first time in known history, law was written on stone, not just recited by priests or kings. The Code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi by centuries, laid out structured penalties for crimes, clear, measurable, and standardized. Justice was no longer arbitrary. It was institutional dot, and then came the writing, but not in the way one might expect. After centuries of upheaval, you'd expect the script to regress, fracture, evolve. Instead, cuneiform reached its perfection. This was the age when scribes compiled and canonized the great works of Sumerian literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its near-final form, comes from this period. So does a vast catalog of hymns, proverbs, myths, and even satire. Writing became more than administration. It became memory, culture, identity, and somehow, despite war, collapse, and occupation, the language of the gods had not just survived, it had crystallized. What's more mysterious is how economic planning emerged with eerie modernity. You're the Third Kings managed a state-controlled redistribution economy that would make a modern bureaucrat proud. Central warehouses stored grain, textiles, livestock, and precious goods. Labor was divided into categories: farmers, herders, builders, craftsmen, each tracked and paid through rations. Every transaction was logged on tablets: quantity, worker ID, delivery date. Tens of thousands of these tablets have survived. They read like spreadsheets baked in clay. What's strange is not that the system existed, but how complex and wide-reaching it was, without coins, without banks, without paper. And again, the question surfaces: how did they remember? How? Did a people who had lost so much, cities, language dominance, even their independence, reassemble civilization with such clarity? It's as though they weren't rebuilding from scratch. They were following a template, a pattern preserved in ritual and story and memory. And they executed it not with superstition, but with precision. The Year 3 scribes even standardized education, teaching generations of future administrators using structured curricula preserved in adabas, or scribal schools. Even the myths were updated to reflect a new theological order. The gods had returned, but the humans had taken control of the narrative. The Sumerian Renaissance didn't last forever. Eventually, the Amorites and Elamites would rise, new dynasties would replace old ones, and the Sumerian language would fade from spoken use. But what they created during this final bloom endured far beyond their borders. Their laws influenced Babylon. Their architecture inspired Assyria. Their myths survived into Hebrew scripture, Hellenistic philosophy, and even Islamic cosmology. They were the first to fall, and the first to rise again. And in doing so, they left behind a message carved in stone and clay that still whispers, "We remembered everything, even after the gods were silent." By the dawn of the second millennium BC, Sumer was no longer rising. Its towering ziggurats still stood, its laws were still carved in stone, and its scribes still pressed marks into clay, but the pulse was slowing. The names of rulers became foreign. The language of the gods began to fade. And then, almost without a sound, Sumer, the world's first civilization, vanished. But this is no story of fire and conquest. There was no apocalyptic sacking of temples, no widespread destruction of cities. The fall of Sumer was stranger, more gradual, more haunting. It was absorption, not obliteration. The people remained, the cities continued, but the identity, the soul, slowly slipped away. At the center of this quiet collapse was something no army could defeat: the land itself. Southern Mesopotamia had always relied on complex irrigation to sustain agriculture. But over time, centuries of overfarming, poorly Managed canals and aggressive water use led to a creeping, invisible killer salinization. As floodwaters receded, they left behind salt in the soil. Crop yields plummeted. Barley, once the backbone of the economy, failed to grow in the poisoned fields. Famine became common. Populations dwindled, and scribes remarkably recorded this decline in chillingly mathematical detail. In clay tablets dated to the year 3 period, and shortly after, we find bureaucrats calculating rations with greater urgency, priests offering more desperate prayers for agricultural renewal, and kings issuing reforms not to expand their realm, but simply to keep it alive. One document even notes, the grain does not ripen, the canals bring poison. This wasn't a single-season crisis. It was a civilizational rot, slow and systemic, and the Sumerians knew it was happening. But as ecological crisis hollowed out the land, a new wave of people entered the scene, the Amorites. Semitic-speaking tribes from the western deserts. They had long lived on the margins of Sumerian cities, as merchants, laborers, even mercenaries. At first, they were a nuisance, then a force, and eventually they became rulers. Yet what makes this takeover so unusual is its tone. The Amorites didn't burn what they conquered. They inherited it. In cities like Babylon and Nisan, they adopted Sumerian law, temple architecture, and even mythology. They preserved the Sumerian scribal schools. They learned cuneiform. They prayed to Enlil, Inanna, and Utu. In many cases, the only evidence that a dynasty had changed was the ruler's name, no longer in Sumerian, but Akkadian. This is why Sumer didn't fall in the usual sense. It was translated into something else. The most famous Amorite ruler, Hammurabi, who reigned around 1750 BC from Babylon, is often remembered today for his legal code. But even this Babylonian code owes much to Sumer. Hammurabi's laws are written in Akkadian, yes, but modeled on earlier Sumerian codes. His gods were Sumerian in origin. His justice was cosmic in justification, just as Ur-Nammu's had been. Babylon didn't reject Sumer. It repackaged it. So what really happened to Sumer? The answer lies not in a battle, but in a linguistic shift. By around 1700 BC, the Sumerian language was no longer spoken. It survived only in scribal texts, used the way Latin would later be used in medieval Europe, as a sacred, scholarly tongue. But in markets and streets, Akkadian had taken over. Names, prayers, contracts, all slowly shifted. This, more than any invasion, marked the true vanishing. Language is the soul of a culture. And once Sumerian was no longer spoken, the civilization it carried began to dissolve, and yet it never truly disappeared. In temples across Mesopotamia, scribes still studied Sumerian. They copied hymns, myths, medical texts, astronomical lists, preserving the intellectual heritage long after. The people who first wrote them were gone. The Epic of Gilgamesh, finalized during the year 3 Renaissance, would be copied for over 1,000 years across empires. Ziggurats continued to be built using the same sacred proportions. Gods like Enlil and Inanna were renamed but not forgotten. Their myths were retold in Babylonian, Assyrian, even Persian forms. One of the strangest facts about Sumer's disappearance is how peaceful it seems. Unlike the fall of Rome or the collapse of the Maya, there was no civil war, no widespread abandonment of cities. In many cases, temples kept operating. Agricultural records continued. Children were still trained to become scribes, but they were no longer Sumerian scribes. The texts they copied were ancient even to them, holy relics of a world already lost in memory. It's in this quiet absorption that we find the heart of the Sumerian enigma. Their civilization, so pioneering, the first to build cities, write laws, compose literature, measure the stars, did not collapse in fire. It was forgotten in slow silence, and yet, paradoxically, they influenced everyone who came after. The Assyrians expanded on Sumerian bureaucracy. The Babylonians deepened their astronomy. The Hebrews inherited parts of their mythology, the flood, the mountain of the gods, the tree of life. The Greeks saw echoes of their myths in their own. Even the early Muslims, inheriting knowledge from Persian and Syriac scholars, were reading works rooted in Sumerian thinking. In this way, the Sumerians never truly died. They became invisible, not gone, but absorbed into the bones of every civilization that followed. So when we say Sumer fell, what we really mean is that the name fell. The forms endured, the laws endured, the myths endured. What changed was the language that carried them and the memory of those who first gave them shape. Today, when archaeologists dig through the layered dust of Iraq, they find these echoes in buried tablets, shattered statues, and silent temples. In fragments of clay, we see the outlines of a world that once knew things we are still rediscovering. And in the silence of those ruins, we're reminded of something uncomfortable. A civilization doesn't die when it falls. It dies when it's forgotten, but the Sumerians, despite time's erosion, are still speaking in stone, in myth, and law. We just had to learn how to listen again. They disappeared. Their cities crumbled. Their language fell silent for over 2,000 years. But the Sumerians never truly left us. They remain not as people, but as echoes, as myths half remembered, as laws half understood, as questions still unanswered. What began in the mud of the southern Mesopotamian floodplains now reverberates through the foundations of nearly every major civilization that followed. They are the ghost empire, silent, invisible, but everywhere. We see them in the book of Genesis. The 7-day creation story, the Garden of Eden, the talking serpent, the Great Flood, all prefigured in older Sumerian myths. The gods Enlil and Enki mirror the relationships between Elohim, Yahweh, and the Divine Council. Even the Tower of Babel bears a striking resemblance to the ziggurat, the stair-step temple to the heavens, built not in defiance, but as a bridge between the human and the divine. Were these stories borrowed, inherited? Or do they point to something older, a common memory, encoded in myth, passed down through language and migration? In Greek myth, the parallels are just as uncanny. Theogonies, genealogies of the gods, were a Sumerian invention. The Olympians' family drama, their feuds and cosmic wars, echo the earlier tales of divine succession in Sumer. The flood myth, the descent into the underworld, the Sky Father and Earth Mother, all of it exists. First in clay tablets from Uruk and Nippur, centuries before Homer, before Hesiod, before Delphi. Roman law too, bears the fingerprint of Sumer, not in its form, but in its philosophy, codified statutes, fixed penalties, objective standards of justice. These weren't Greek ideas, they were inherited from Babylon, which inherited them from Ur, which inherited them from the Sumerians. Even the concept of a written legal code began with Ur-Nammu's laws, carved in stone not as royal decree, but as divine order. And then there's Islamic science, the golden age of Baghdad, where astronomers, doctors, and philosophers translated ancient knowledge into Arabic. Many of those translations came from Persian and Syriac sources, who had preserved fragments of Akkadian texts, which in turn preserved even older Sumerian ideas. Lunar calendars, algebraic calculations, anatomical studies all found echoes in Sumerian texts. What we think of as medieval innovation was, in part, the reactivation of a much older memory, but perhaps the strangest chapter in all. This is how we rediscovered them, by accident. In the 19th century, European archaeologists digging for biblical cities stumbled across buried libraries, piles of broken clay tablets, covered in strange wedge-shaped marks. It took decades to decipher, and when they did, they didn't believe it. There were lists of kings older than the Bible, stories of floods and immortality, mathematics in base 60. The language was unlike anything they knew. They had found the voice of a civilization no one even remembered existed, and in those texts, something else emerged, a philosophy so modern it still unsettles. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written over 4,000 years ago, a king seeks eternal life, only to be told he cannot have it. He slays monsters, crosses oceans, meets gods, and yet returns with nothing, except the wisdom that life is short, and meaning must be made in the face of death. That's not mythology. That's existentialism. How did a Bronze Age people write with such clarity about grief, futility, and the fear of being forgotten? Gilgamesh doesn't ascend to godhood. He reaps, he fails, he accepts. That story is older than Homer, older than Moses, and somehow it knows us. It speaks not just to the ancient world, but to every modern mind that has ever asked, what happens when I die? The Sumerians weren't just the first civilization. They were the first to ask the big questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Can the future be predicted? Can justice be universal? And above all, how do we live knowing we will die? These questions echo through everything they left behind, not as answers, but as templates. The first time the human species shaped its world with writing, city planning, bureaucracy, and myth, it was Sumer doing the shaping. And in that shaping, they created a pattern civilization would repeat over and over again. Emergence, ascent, complexity, collapse, and memory. But no memory lasts forever. The world forgot them once, and it could again. The Sumerians weren't just the first civilization. They were the template, but science still can't explain why they began when they did, or how they knew what they knew. We study ancient history to understand ourselves, but with the Sumerians, the more we uncover, the more the questions deepen. How did they learn to write without precursors? How did they align their cities to the stars without telescopes? How did they encode myth with philosophy? And why do their gods, their stories, their laws, their fears look so much like our own? Civilization was supposed to evolve slowly, but the Sumerians emerged suddenly, fully formed, with no obvious precursor, no parent culture, just the template, as if someone had passed it to them. Science explains the artifacts. It can model the trade routes, the flood patterns, the metallurgy, but it still can't explain the leap. The moment when mud became mathematics and myth became memory. The moment the gods first stepped down onto temple steps of stone, and men began to ask them why not. And so we're left with a strange truth. We're still living in a world they imagined. In our laws, in our literature, in the silent architecture of our myths, they are not gone. They are ghostwritten into everything. What science can't explain. We must learn to remember.